The scholar expert today has a status and role both commonplace and indispensable. This was not always so. The change began with U.S. participation in the First World War, when professional historians from the most respected universities in the country were brought into government service as technical experts and advisors.
Woodrow Wilson and the American delegation arrived in Paris on Friday the 13th, 1918, to large inspired crowds. The Anglo-American mission hidden within the red, white, and blue bunting and obligatory sloganry. Wilson is welcomed a hero even before the final act, as the onlookers and well-wishers are hopelessly lost, caught up in the undertow of a classic Bernaysian creation of circumstance. Wilson's hero's welcome in Paris, in fact, largely due to the work of the very father of propaganda himself, Edward Bernays, and the Committee on Public Information, the first propaganda arm of the U.S. government. Wilson aided also by George Creel, the figurehead of the CPI, and Wilson's close friend and future biographer Ray Stannard Baker, the famous socialist muckraker, was the head of the press bureau in Paris. Helping to both secure the progressive message and stifle any internal criticisms, together they helped establish the president as a savior, even before he arrived. The public hopeful Wilson was bringing with him to Paris a new heaven on earth. He became, quote, the spokesman of the moral and spiritual forces of the world, end quote. And the goal going into Paris, admitted by Bernays himself many years later, was to make Wilson a Godhead symbol. As the American delegation wound its way through the streets to the very center core of Paris, they are nearly capsized within the ebb and flow of their own manufactured importance. The peace talks build as the conference to establish a new and lasting world peace. And the American delegation, on the international stage for the first time, was to deliver on that promise. According to Wilson, the Great War was supposed to, quote, make the world safe for democracy, end quote. Famous Fabian H.G. Wells stated it was to be, quote, the war to end all wars, end quote. Although verifiably false today, these slogans remain as the generally believed reasons for the Great War. 100-year-old headlines now considered poorly aged propaganda, from maybe even before the ink was dry. Yet here we are, their children of the future, some 4 generations later, finding ourselves in an historically unique position to both bear witness to and cast final judgment on the long-term results of the Great War and the peace talks that followed. When they left New York, the Inquiry were a group of obscure social science professors. But by the time the conference got underway, they were intelligence chiefs. The technical experts guiding many delegations at the peace talks by what they called a unity of aim. Each division chief was handpicked for both his particular field of study and his progressive liberal leanings. The entire conference itself was presented within a framework of self-determination, social equality, and reform. The Germans not even invited, allowing the victors to control the present, the past, and the future. The Inquiry, by usurping the authority of the State Department, would play a leading role in Paris by redrawing the boundaries of Central Europe, authoring all 5 peace treaties, and the conference's primary achievement, the first international governing body, the Covenant of the League of Nations. Each Inquiry member led their own division within the territorial and economic section of the American delegation, each having very limited involvement with the work of the other. The men of the Inquiry were compartmentalized, focused on their own particular fields. According to a key member of the Inquiry, James T. Shotwell, 4 days after their arrival, the entire organizational structure of the American delegation was reorganized, and the inquiry placed in a leading advisory role, even more intimate than that of Wilson's own Secretary of State, Robert Lansing. The State Department and military intelligence have both been obliged to yield recognition to the inquiry, which in future is to advise the commissioners directly and not at second hand. The inquiry was deeply involved in many important aspects in Paris, assisting the commissioners and plenipotentiaries with data and recommendations, fulfilling important advisory responsibilities within all delegations of all the countries present, even leading diplomatic missions to specific areas in Europe during the peace talks to consult and counsel foreign governments, even traveling to Russia to meet with Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. These men of the inquiry were the best in their fields, many graduating top of class, nearly every single member emerging from a network of the oldest fraternal secret societies in America, with oaths of loyalty to those beyond public interest, sharing unspoken allegiances. These academic connections serving as an initiation into later life memberships, and the various esteemed gentlemen's clubs of New York and Washington high society, the most influential of which they created themselves, the Council on Foreign Relations. As explained by CFR member Peter Gross in his Continuing the Inquiry, quote, a typical council officer belonged to 3 social clubs: the Century and Knickerbocker in New York, and the Cosmos and Metropolitan in Washington were the most popular. The historical record of the Paris Peace Conference focuses on the meetings of the major powers. To those of the inquiry, however, and the colleagues they gathered among diplomatic and military officers in Europe, these plenary sessions mattered little. For them, the daily teas at the Quai d'Orsay, the bridge games, the breakfast and dinner meetings of experts from a dozen countries gave enduring personal meaning to the peace conference. On May 30th, 1919, a little group of diplomats and scholars from Britain and the United States convened at the Hotel Majestic to discuss how their fellowship could be sustained after the peace. They proposed a permanent Anglo-American Institute of International Affairs with one branch in London, the other in New York.
It was only when these separate sections were finally put together that the makers of the different parts of the treaty became aware of the nature of the whole document. Each specialist was to work on his task without regard to what his colleagues were doing. It was even regarded as a somewhat illegitimate interest for any of the so-called experts to inquire about anything not in their own field.
In Paris, the inquiry were led by Isaiah Bowman, the chief territorial specialist and executive officer. Bowman was especially influential in determining borders in the Balkan region, was an advisory member of the Polish Commission, the Central Territorial Commission, the Romanian Yugoslav Commission, and the Polish-Ukrainian Armistice Commission. And it is largely because of both Bowman's direction of the inquiry and his work within the various delegations at the peace conference itself that served as a springboard to a lifetime in statecraft. Bowman, later the head of Franklin Roosevelt's Science Advisory Board, and a delegation member, along with several other inquiry alumni, at Dumbarton Oaks in 1944 and San Francisco in 1945 for the signing of the United Nations. Bowman, who would later serve as president of Johns Hopkins University during the Manhattan Project, is considered today a founding lifetime member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a pioneer in both geopolitical and international relations. The need for experienced men of international law was spearheaded by the contributions of inquiry members James Brown Scott and David Hunter Miller. Scott of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, working directly under Elihu Root, and David Hunter Miller, a New York lawyer and highly recommended expert in international treaties. Both Scott and Miller, considered today American pioneers of international relations, took a backseat to no one when helping author Wilson's 14 Points, the Covenant of the League of Nations, and the Treaty of Versailles. James Brown Scott, founder of the Academy of International Law, the American Society of International Law, its journal, the American Journal of International Law, and USC Law School. Miller was the legal counsel to the entire American delegation and worked as a historical advisor to the State Department for decades. The work accomplished in Paris finally set the foundations for an international force of law that had been in the making since the First International in 1864, and the work of both Scott and Miller proved indispensable. Charles Homer Haskins, chief of the Western European Division of the American Commission at Paris, was a child protege, graduate of JHU at 16. In 1911, Haskins served on the American Historical Association Committee, co-writing the report, The Study of History in Secondary Schools. He was named president of the AHA in 1919 and dean of the Graduate School of Fine Arts and Sciences at Harvard, helping establish curriculum. This is how history gets told by the victor and believed by generations. Haskins, in essence, a creator of Orwell's memory hole and an architect of the Matrix.
And if all others accepted the lie which the party imposed, if all records told the same tale, then the lie passed into history and became truth. Who controls the past, ran the party slogan, controls the future. Who controls the present, controls the past.
The military members of the inquiry were central in the creation of the modern U.S. intelligence community long before the OSS or the CIA. The inquiry, working directly with the head of military intelligence, General Marlborough Churchill, the man most attributed with founding the cryptoanalytic group, the Black Chamber. Churchill here bringing together for the first time the State Department and the War Department, laying the groundwork for the National Security Agency some 30 years before Truman. Churchill, the general military liaison and coordinating officer in Paris, and a direct relative of Winston. The inquiry was made up exclusively of political and social science experts, boasting within its rank and file several founding members of the Council on Foreign Relations. At least 24 inquiry members possessing an Ivy League Bachelor of Liberal Arts degree, many with a Master of Arts degree. Nearly all were professors of either economics or history at the most prestigious universities in the country, and more than a few elected presidents of national institutions like the American Historical Association, the American Statistical Association, the American Economic Association, and the American Anthropological Association. By filling these roles, they became authorities of entire fields of social science study, ensuring their progressive school of thought would continue well into the following generations. A new blueprint was needed, a new design affected by an expert staff of social engineers. Out of the embers of war, inquiry scientists and engineers were ready to fashion a new world order. The inquiry, like any institution of its time, reflected the assumptions and values of the early 20th century. Its virtues and failings stand firmly against the backdrop of its times. Progressive ideals had placed a heavy premium on social planning. Experts, specialists of all kinds, were often credited with possessing both the particular skills and personal disinterestedness considered desired requisites for social planning. Reform of the world's society to prevent future international warfare became the assignment for the inquiry's engineers. It will be many years before the history of the Peace Conference can be written. Its work was too vast and too varied. Its records are too scattered and too inaccessible, many of them still unwritten. We are still too near for a true perspective. Now, over 100 years has passed since the signing of the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. and the results are clear for all to see. No longer are the records scattered. No longer are we too near for a true perspective. The Paris Peace Conference was a grand illusion, the American delegation largely represented not by those interested in peace, pacifism, or democracy, but by business interests, only concerned with establishing a new international world order. Of primary concern to the new international movement in Paris was the elimination of the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman monarchies, the controlling of German natural resources, the main Rhine-Danube Canal, the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, Middle Eastern oil, and the reimbursement of all debt owed J.P. Morgan and his war-profiteering friends. Inspiring Frederick C. Howe to write later in Confessions of a Reformer, quote, "It is impossible to tell yet whether peace is being drafted by the international bankers or the munition makers. Economic forces moved the conference like players about a chessboard. Boundary lines were shifted to include harbors, copper, oil, and mineral resources. The imperialist interests that had kept the world on edge for 30 years before the war were making a killing. The British Admiralty wanted oil, the fuel of tomorrow. The French Steel Trust wanted a grip on coal and iron ore to gain command of the continent and strip Germany of her war-making power. Munition makers were busy getting ready for the next war." Peace conferences are always represented as sitting around green tables, and this pleasant fiction is perpetuated with reference to Paris. The Paris Conference never sat around a table. It is true that for certain formal sessions of the whole conference there was arranged a long table lining 3 sides of the principal room in the French Foreign Office on the Quai d'Orsay, but there were very few formal meetings of this sort, and they could not by any stretch of the imagination be thought of as round-table conferences, if indeed as conferences at all. Lunch at the Inner Allied Club, to which I've been elected a member. Baron Rothschild's house has been given over to the French, British, and American officers, and the 2 dining rooms were filled.
I took Butler over to dinner at the Inner Allied Club. It is the Rothschild mansion on the Faubourg Saint-Honor, and we dined out on the lawn at the back of the house looking into the good-sized park that runs over to the Champs-Élysées. It was the most beautiful sight I have seen in Paris.
What has resulted from the 1919 Paris peace talks is the exact opposite of what their obligatory sloganry promised upon their arrival, as we living today, the alleged benefactors, now endure a world of near perpetual war emanating from the very same geographical region as it was then. In many ways, the inquiry in Paris representing the very institutions and corporations that control our modern day, representing more than just the long-awaited Anglo-American reunion through the founding of both the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations. The inquiry in Paris is nothing less than the very origins of the modern U.S. intelligence community, U.S. foreign policy, the military-industrial complex, and the National Security Agency many presidents before Truman or Eisenhower. The inquiry, the pioneers of what Ike called a scientific, technological elite, authoring the founding documents of both the United Nations and NATO. These pioneering scientific experts, more than writing a document of peace, were the authors of the next World War. And just as those surrounding President Wilson constructed domestically an administrative state to govern society in his first term, they did now in Paris internationally. A collective security imposed on the basis of social equity and selective self-determination. The Paris Peace Conference, according to Gregory Bateson, was the greatest sellout in human history, and provides a clear lesson in how good intentions can pave the road to hell. And instead of delivering an idyllic dream, these men of money, power, and influence created the blueprint for our real-life, modern-day dystopian nightmare.